Thank you, Doug, for that introduction. First, I would like to start off and thank the conference organizers for inviting me to present and talk about my story today. And I also want to acknowledge the original peoples of this land that we are on, the Duwamish people, and thank them for allowing us to come together in this space and hold this conference and give us a space for us to learn from each other. So today I will share my story as a researcher, and as a researcher who's also working with a community that I am from. And so I'll talk a bit about some of the challenges that I faced in navigating trust, obligations, and commitments that I have had to face in the context of doing community-based participatory research or community-based research. But before I start, I want to properly introduce myself because I know Doug Diekema couldn't do this for me, and introduce myself in Navajo so that this can properly set the stage for the rest of my talk. So here's an old photo of me in a Navajo dress, and I'm from the Navajo tribe. So Yate she'e Nanibaa Garrison Yinishya, Ashi Hinishle, Do Bilagana Bushichin, Todajiti Deshiche, Bilagana Deshanella, Todanesha Dant Nasha. So in my introduction, I had said that I said my name, I'm Nanibaa Garrison, and I am from the Salt clan, which is my mother's clan, and my father is white, so I come from a mixed background. I also told you that my grandfather on my mother's side is from the Bitterwater clan, and my grandfather on my dad's side is white. And that's the proper way of introducing oneself in Navajo. And I'm originally from Tsaya, Arizona, which is which is the picture that you see there. And so you can see it's a very remote part of the Navajo Nation. And this is where I grew up. I also want to just pause here and reflect back on a talk that Doug Diekema gave yesterday. And he shared a picture of Shiprock, which is also another place where I grew up. And that's also located on the Navajo Nation. And so I want to add to his story by adding my perspective to this and kind of illustrating some of the issues that come up with cultural differences and cultural perspectives. So yesterday when Doug Diekema was describing Shiprock as a place where it's a top 10 location for rock climbers, and this is a rock that is very difficult to ascend, I was sitting in the back of the room a little bit horrified, a little bit nervous. What is he going to say about this location? Because we hold Shiprock as a very sacred place in our space. And I was afraid that he was going to advocate that we should all go rock climbing there, but I knew he wasn't going to go there, but I was a little bit apprehensive, waiting to hear what he was going to say. And I just wanted to illustrate that because for us as Navajo people, Shiprock is, it's not just a sacred rock, and it's not exactly a rock or a structure or a mountain or a geological feature that we hold as a space of healing, and I know a lot of times when we talk about different spaces, we talk about them as places that you go for spiritual connections and for healing and things like that. But Shiprock actually has a longer and complicated history, and I don't have time to go into it, plus it's not the appropriate time of the year to tell those particular stories, but it's a location where a lot of our a lot of our cultural origins have taken place, and it's associated with bad omens and death. And so I wanted to share that it's also forbidden for people to climb that rock. And I tried to verify this yesterday, but I believe it's written in Navajo law somewhere that nobody is allowed to go and ascend that rock. And it's also, we believe that it's protected by our rattlesnake relatives. And so it's very challenging to actually physically get there. And so out of respect, I just want to urge that you don't climb Shiprock. So you're probably wondering where I'm talking about and where these places are that I'm describing. And so the Navajo Nation, as you see on the map, is located in the four corners of the U.S., and most of the Navajo Nation is in Arizona. And by comparison, it's actually about the size of West Virginia. So geographically, it's a pretty large and expansive stretch of land. And the picture on the right is a flag kind of superimposed on the geographical boundaries of our nation. Our nation has since expanded, so they don't match up exactly anymore. But I grew up, let's see, I'm not sure if there's a pointer. So I grew up right around there, and Shiprock is right around there, so about 100 miles apart from each other. And I am still very connected to the space and the land and the people who are there. So I was born, as I mentioned, on the Navajo reservation, and this picture here is actually very personal for me because it's a picture of two of my maternal aunts holding their babies that was taken in the 1950s sometime, and this is actually a postcard that you can find in some places as you go across the Navajo Nation. Our family didn't realize that this postcard was in circulation until many, many years later, and then we suddenly came upon it and started buying these postcards like crazy. But I learned although I grew up in a household that was half white and half Navajo, I really grew up on the Navajo reservation, and I learned to read, write, speak Navajo from my mother. But to my greatest regret, I never became fluent, and I think part of it is because of the challenges that my mother faced while she was going through boarding school, and the punishments that people had when they were being punished for speaking their own language. And so she didn't really impose or push us to really speak the language fluently. And so I focused instead on my studies in biology, and growing up, I was one of a handful of kids who was not full Navajo. So although you might not necessarily know just by looking at me, but if you were to compare me to other people, phenotypically, I'm a lot lighter skinned. My hair is a lot lighter color. I have more hair on my forearms than my Navajo colleague or friends growing up, and so I stuck out as being very different. And my dad, was a hippie who ended up on the Navajo reservation, so that was also a big thing that stuck out. So I share this partly because I never felt like I fit in, and I was constantly walking these two worlds of being Navajo, being white, moving back and forth from a Navajo community to an academic, predominantly white community, and trying to navigate my responsibilities in both settings. And I took refuge in my work that has really led me to genetics and now bioethics, and I'll describe a little bit of that. And the whole purpose of this, of me sharing this, is just to kind of illustrate the different complexities that I face in navigating these two worlds. And so little did I know that my mixed background and upbringing would really have me walking my path with 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So this picture here is a road that I frequently traveled on the Navajo reservation. And in the course of conducting research for me, I'm actually constantly navigating this road of trying to make sure that I'm on the straight path and thinking clearly and trying to balance things on both sides. I also want to share stories from my personal journey and then link them to 6 different lessons that I've learned along the way that I hope will really help us to have a broader conversation about what it means to be culturally respectful, thinking about the obligations that one has. And if you're looking at my slides, that's what the slides are about. I didn't put all of the fun pictures into my slides. But sometimes in conducting research, we're so focused on coming up with the most compelling testable hypotheses, making solid arguments to grant reviewers to obtain funding. We're focused on getting letters of support from people that we want to collaborate with or community members to show that we can indeed recruit participants from the studies that from the places that we're talking about, or get the work done. And for me personally, as a young investigator, I was very naively under the impression that if I'm working with my own community, I can easily recruit people from my own community. They know me, I know them. It should be pretty simple, and I found out very quickly that I was very wrong about that. At the time when I started doing research, I also was not fully aware of the larger historical context in which American Indians, including my tribe, had been facing with genetic research studies, and so it forced me to kind of learn a crash course in some of the complexities of working with historically marginalized communities and what that means for research. So I want to contextualize that by talking very briefly about a well-known case that many of you may have heard about. So this case was widely publicized and ended up on the front page of the New York Times in 2010. The Havasupai tribe of Arizona, which is another tribe located not too far from the Navajo Nation, they live in the Grand Canyon, and they learned that their genetic samples or their DNA samples had been used for other studies that were not initially approved of. So they embarked initially on a research study to investigate the underpinnings of diabetes in their community. They had, at the time in the 1990s, about 50% of adults had a type 2 diabetes, and they were very concerned about this growing problem. and about 400 Havasupai people had donated their samples for a genetic research study that they believed to be on diabetes. The samples were, the studies didn't really pan out, and the investigator used those studies for other used those samples for other studies on schizophrenia, inbreeding, and human migration. And the tribe was very upset, and in 2003, when they found out, they actually found out because a Havasupai tribe member attended a dissertation defense where the student who was trying to graduate was using these samples to demonstrate some linkages with human migration and other populations worldwide. And that Havasupai member asked, at the end of the defense, asked if they had the appropriate permissions to use those samples for those studies on human migration. It turned into a lawsuit that was very messy, and the tribe filed suit in 2004. They gained support from a lot of tribes in the area throughout the regions and also across the country, and prompted a lot of tribes to take notice and really think critically about the impact of engaging in genetic research within their jurisdiction or reservation boundaries. And it didn't just extend to, it wasn't just about genetic research, it was about a lot of other things related to research. I also just want to point out that there were a lot of cultural reasons why the Havasupai were upset. In the picture that you see on the front page of the New York Times, one of the Havasupai members is going down into the canyon where they live, and they believe that, according to the oral histories, that they are actually from, their people emerged from the Grand Canyon, from the floor of the Grand Canyon. And to hear scientists say that they're, according to their DNA, that they had gone across the Bering Strait from Asia over to the Americas, that conflicted with their understandings of where they came from. And so it was very upsetting for the tribe. And this story is actually personal for me too, because around that time, I was an undergraduate student when the Havasupai case started. But these pictures are of a trip that I took down to the Havasupai and to Supai Falls in 1999, before the case even started. And so I knew exactly where this community was living. I knew exactly how hard it was to get there. It's very remote, and the only ways to get to the bottom of the Grand Canyon or to the Supai village is by foot, donkey, or helicopter. And so you can imagine that there are very limited resources that can be brought down to Supai village. And for geneticists, this created a very attractive population for them to study because it was a geographically isolated population. So at the time, I was actually an undergraduate student at the University of Arizona, about 100 miles away from this place. And I was very concerned hearing about these samples being used for other studies. And it turned out that a lot of other investigators at the University of Arizona, when I was there, had Havasupai DNA in their freezers. And so what did this really mean? For me, this is kind of one of the first lessons that I want to share. And I'll continue to build upon these different stories as I go along, but I learned that it's really important to be transparent and honest. In this case, there wasn't a whole lot of transparency, and the tribe felt that they were lied to. And so for me personally going forward, one of the lessons that I've learned is to try to be very clear about what the project goals are about and keep the community engaged and informed as research moves along. And to really try to be as truthful as you possibly can, even if you cannot anticipate all future uses of samples. Be truthful about potential uses as well. So here I was, this picture was actually taken at a different laboratory, but I was at the University of Arizona, and I was very interested in genetics. And as an undergraduate student, right around the time as the Havasupai case started, I ended up in a research lab where I was studying oculocutaneous albinism. And my advisor had some DNA samples from some patients who were Navajo. And so I was very, very curious. And he offered me a chance to work in his lab and investigate the genetic underpinnings for oculocutaneous albinism in these Navajo individuals. I had a lot of questions too. So why did my advisor have Navajo samples? How did he get them? Maybe he had some good relationships with some Navajo people, and it turned out that he did. He knew the donors personally, and he met with them frequently and just kept them updated on things that he was learning about albinism in general. But I was also very curious about albinism because people with albinism have light hair, blue eyes, and kind of a strawberry blonde hair color. which really stands out in a Navajo community where phenotypically people are much darker than I am, or not super dark, but like a couple shades darker than I am, darker hair color and darker eye color than I have. I knew a couple of kids with albinism growing up, so I was very curious. So I joined the lab and carried out a bunch of different genetic experiments. I didn't really find anything initially, and after many, many failed experiments, we finally came to the realization that we were actually working with a sample that had a very large deletion in a known albinism gene. And so this was the first time that, this particular deletion had never been identified in the literature before. So this set me out onto this really incredible, interesting journey where I was wondering who this individual was and whether or not this individual is unique, or if it was the same in, if we would see the same mutation or the deletion in other people with albinism who were Navajo. And so I set out to collect and recruit, I set out to recruit Navajo individuals and collect DNA samples, buccal swab samples from their cheek, to get a better sense of what the carrier frequency of this deletion was. And in doing so, keep in mind this is right before the Havasupai case started too, so it kind of gives you some context. I was working very hard to build trust with people who I was talking to, and they would ask questions like, "Where are you from?" And I had to repeat the introduction that I gave you in Navajo multiple times to multiple people and introduce myself and really contextualize who I was, who my parents are. They wanted to know what I was going to do with the sample and how I was going to use the sample in the lab. Some people asked me, will you give the DNA sample back to me after you're finished investigating it in the lab? And so that made us really think, how do we handle biospecimens? How do we handle biological waste and things like that? And we had to find ways to be respectful of being able to honor those requests. Other people asked, how many other people agreed to do this? Should I trust you? And how many other people trusted you? And people also ask, can you give me some time to talk with my parents? Let me talk with my elders. I want to make sure that this is okay for you to take my sample. And I also learned a lot of very important cultural beliefs about albinism and some oral histories about where Navajo people believed albinism came from. And I won't go into that now, but I found it such an incredible, rich experience for me. And because I was able to speak Navajo, I think I was able to recruit as many people as I did. And because I understood the cultural concerns and was able to adapt and adjust and do different things to find creative ways so that although we triple coded the sample, so I would never know the identity of with the PCR sample that I was running on a gel, so I would never know who exactly within my sample had albinism or had carried albinism. We still went through this very complicated process of triple coding everything so that we can return the correct sample back to the person if they wanted it at the end of the study. And we ended up publishing our findings in the American Journal of Human Genetics, and I had plans to go back to the Navajo Nation and share what we found with them. And literally about a month after the paper came out in the American Journal of Human Genetics, the Navajo Nation passed a moratorium on genetic research studies, banning all genetic research studies on the Navajo Nation with Navajo people. And I was completely surprised. Why did they do this? I learned later that the answer is very complicated, and it still is very complicated. And it really had nothing to do with my project. The Havasupai case hadn't started yet, so it wasn't because of that. But we came to recognize that the Navajo Nation was getting a lot of requests for Navajo people to engage in genetic research studies, but they didn't feel like they had the expertise, the knowledge, the rules, the infrastructure in place at that time to really evaluate these protocols in a way that would protect the Navajo people. And so after a series of discussions, they decided that maybe we'll just put a moratorium on this for now. We'll come back to this later. And then less than a year later, the Havasupai filed their lawsuit. And so the Navajo Nation decided not to focus on this moratorium for many years. And so here I was still in the lab wondering how the Havasupai case affected me. I saw that it affected a lot of my other investigators because they had DNA samples in their freezers. I had a lot of concerns. I worked very, very hard to be culturally respectful We even asked the Navajo IRB if we should retract our paper out of respect, but they were not concerned about the paper. It was this larger historical context. But I think, upon reflection, I think it was very serendipitous that I ended up in a laboratory where my advisor had these samples, because as all of these events were unfolding under me, I felt like I was in the right place to start asking some of the right questions and to start putting some of the right cultural protocols in place. And it was completely eye-opening to the rest of the research team. They had no idea what some of the concerns were that people had. It never even occurred to anybody to triple code things in order to be able to give back DNA samples to an individual so they can respectfully dispose of it in a culturally appropriate manner. And after finishing my undergraduate work, I went on to graduate school with the intention of completing a PhD in genetics. I was very interested in genetics. And as it turns out, I was actually the first person in my tribe to obtain a PhD in genetics, and I was actually either the third or fourth. We kind of have a little bit of a debate going. I was the third or fourth in the country as an indigenous person to obtain a PhD in genetics. And so as you can imagine, that leaves me in a place where there's very few people to reach out to who understand some of the same shared cultural values and struggles that I face as well. But this leads me to the second lesson that I want to share, is just to embrace cultural perspectives. And I'm still learning how to do this, and you'll hear me say this again and again, but I spent a lot of time in my community listening to people. Even though I was from there, I learned a lot just by listening to some of the concerns that people had. And I had to find ways to be very creative to adapt to some of the cultural dynamics or the cultural concerns. And I also just want to impart to people, like if you're working with a community, to enter communities with humility, empathy, and a willingness to just listen and learn. Sometimes what they want is just to be heard. So this picture here is taken in Window Rock, Arizona, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. So the Navajo Nation Council chambers are behind on the other side of me. I took the picture, so it was kind of behind me. And the next part of my story takes place over 16 years. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about all 16 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the Navajo Nation passed a moratorium on genetic research studies in 2002. And at that time, I was applying to graduate schools and really interested in going into genetics. Years later, in 2010, the Havasupai tribe were in litigation with their lawsuit, and I had left genetics and moved into bioethics, and I'm still very, very forever grateful to Ben Wilfon for being one of those people who encouraged me to make that big jump into bioethics. I tried to study the reasons for the Navajo Nation enacting the moratorium as a postdoctoral fellow because I wanted to do something. I thought, coming out of a PhD program, I thought, I have the skills now, I understand genetics, I'm going to go back and help my tribe. Boy, was I naive. So I spent some time going back and forth between Stanford, where I was doing my postdoc, and the Navajo Nation, and trying to get this project going and working with a lot of different community people to try to get a sense of what I needed to do in order to help my tribe lift this moratorium on genetic research, and they needed to develop a genetic research policy. But at the time, genetics was not a priority. People were still looking at the Havasupai case and still wondering how it was going to end. They had a lot of different priorities about other things, and there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about genetics. And so it just was not the right time. I was incredibly frustrated because I spent all this time and energy and effort going back and forth and trying to get this project up and going. But I'm really glad now that I never showed my frustration, because I think it was really important to kind of think through about the reputation that you're building, especially as an investigator and working with your community. And so just over a year ago, I was invited back to my tribe to think about what it would take to develop a genetic research policy. So, 16 years after the moratorium, I was invited back to by my tribe to think about this. I was really excited, really nervous, excited because this is what I trained my whole life to do. And I thought, how could I turn down this incredible opportunity to work with my tribe? And so in doing so, I'm learning a lot of different things about what it means to engage, what it means to collaborate, what it means to build community partnerships and long-term partnerships. I'm learning what it means to build trust and invite community members to the research table early. In doing all of this work, I also had to go through a very rigorous IRB process, which I'll tell you in a minute, and really learn what it means to collaborate in a way that is respectful and on the terms of my tribe, on my tribe's terms, even though I'm from there. It doesn't give me it doesn't always guarantee that collaboration will happen. But in agreeing to help in writing a genetic research policy, we put on a conference last year with only 2 months of planning. It was really intense. And we had about 200 people attend this because they were really curious about genetic research studies, what it means. And we gained a lot of media attention. You can see a short newspaper clipping here. And we also brought together a lot of different people. So the other picture here is of some of the conference organizers with our Navajo Nation president and representatives from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And in this whole invitation of coming back to my community and having them ask me to help write a genetic research policy, I thought, well, I'm an academic, so I need to think about what it takes to get promoted, and I need to obtain grants and get publications. So how am I going to do this work and still meet all of those benchmarks? So I suggested that we also tie in a research project by collecting empirical data. And I thought it would be great to interview Navajo people to really get their sense of what their thoughts are on genetics, what their concerns are, and what recommendations do they have for a policy. So this led me down a crash course of obtaining tribal IRB approval from the Navajo Nation. Has anybody done that or obtained tribal IRB? The Navajo Nation is one of the most intense IRB institutional review boards out there, and they have a 12-step process that requires all sorts of engagement activities. You have to go to different agencies within the Navajo Nation and obtain letters of resolution from each of those agencies, and there's 5 agencies across the reservation, and I also had to present the project to the IRB in person. And I think for me, there were additional added complexities because we had a moratorium on genetic research, and so there's some legal backing to this, and it was so charged, and the idea of thinking about genetics is steeped in a long history of mistrust. And so the IRB actually had legal representation from the Navajo Department of Justice to attend my presentation to the Navajo IRB, partly to keep me in check, but also just to make sure that I was going to adhere to the legalities of the Navajo Nation's moratorium. And I also obtained pilot funding from 2 different sources, the Seattle Children's CCTR Pilot Fund and also the Center for Diversity and Health Equity. And so that really helped to jumpstart this project, and it was incredibly stressful. I had to be patient. I had to wait a lot of times and wait for my turn to be allowed to speak. I had to be open, very honest, very transparent, address every question that people had. I had to repeat my introduction in Navajo many, many times and respond to people in Navajo, which was really hard for me because I am rusty with the Navajo language. I haven't really been back there in such a long time, and I'm still learning what it means to understand all of these different regulations. And so this is the next lesson that I wanted to share is just to understand the local regulations with different communities that you want to work with, whether it's tribes or communities of color or diverse communities in an inner city setting. Communities have their own different ways of regulating research. Some of them might be more formal in nature, and others might be less formal, where you might just have to attend certain types of review board processes. And there might be different expectations that communities have. And so I found that working with and not against the research review boards has really helped me to collaborate and strengthen my overall trajectory. And I know that other people have had challenges working with different tribal IRBs, and so trying to find ways to honor and respect the wishes that they had, I think was really incredibly important. And then the next thing that I want to share is not so much of a story for me or about me, but it's more of a passion that I have. And as I work in different community settings, many questions come up a lot about what is the purpose of the research project that you're proposing? Why is it important? We have so many other health priorities, so many other competing issues. Your research project is just not a priority in my community. And a lot of questions also come up around who can we trust? And why can't our own people do this work? And so since 2010, I have been a core faculty member for the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics. And so some of these pictures are from that program that I helped to run. And we've grown over the years to bring together about 50 people that includes a mix of students, community members, and faculty from across the country. And we've even broadened out to New Zealand and Canada and bring in faculty members and students and participants from those places. And we actually have this program, it will be held in Seattle starting tomorrow, so I'm kind of in a crazy spot of trying to navigate all of these different things here. But one of the things I want to point out is this picture. Oops, sorry. Here, I want to highlight one of my favorite pictures. This is one of the Tribal Council delegates that I work very closely with on the Navajo genetic research policy. We invited him to this workshop last year because he had a lot of questions about genetics. And here he is pipetting DNA and conducting a simple genetic experiment. And although he went through the program, he didn't fully understand what it was what we're talking about when we talked about DNA and what DNA looks like. And a couple of weeks later, a colleague and I were running a different program, and we had him come as well, and he extracted strawberry DNA, or extracted DNA from strawberries, and all of a sudden I saw all these light bulbs going off in his head. He started to understand what we mean when we talk about DNA and where DNA is and how many steps it takes to get into, to break down the strawberry and get the DNA out of that. So it's been incredibly gratifying to work with people who are starting to embrace and learn these different aspects of the research and find ways to really try to collaborate with them and bring them into the whole process. So we've been working with students and building capacity for people to gain different skills and encourage them to pursue careers in areas that our people can be benefiting from. And so the fifth lesson that I want to share is just about promoting research capacity, and this can be done in many different ways. And so for people who are doing research or working in different community settings, you can recruit and train community members to conduct research or be a part of the project or the work that you're involved in, and mentor promising students. There's so many promising students out there. And also just embrace community perspectives, invite people to the table, help them to understand the science so they can help interpret the results and provide new insights that you hadn't really thought about before. So that's what I did. This picture is a couple of years old. When I was presenting to the Navajo Research Conference, they had a session on what is genetics, and so I wasn't exactly presenting research here, but I was trying to find ways to describe concepts about genetics using culturally relevant materials, and so I used corn and sheep as two different examples because those are very important in our culture, and so I was trying to demonstrate what it means to do selective breeding, and our people have already been doing genetics, we're just thinking about it in a different way, and we do it in a different way than how it's done in a laboratory. So the sixth lesson I want to share is to find ways to disseminate your findings in very culturally accessible formats. Sometimes that might mean having to work with and collaborate with people who understand the culture better than you might to help think about how to tailor that content. But you can invite community members to help write that content. And I would also just say it's fun to be creative, and you can use all sorts of different media platforms, community newspapers, radio, different ways of talking about and engaging people in the science. So I want to bring this all back to a local issue, and so some of you who are at Seattle Children's might be familiar with this story. So when I first came to Seattle Children's about 3 years ago, the Forest building had an elevator bank called the OWL elevators. And some people might ask, what's wrong with owls? Many people think of them as being a wise old owl. And it turns out, and I knew this growing up, that for a lot of indigenous cultures in the Americas, the owl is associated with bad omens and death. And the owl is the bringer of bad news. And so the OWL elevator was located in the emergency department. And oncology, and the ICU, yes. All of these places where people come in extremely stressed, their kid is in sometimes a very dire situation, and then you see the owl, which is a bringer of the worst possible news. And so for a lot of families, they came to the hospital I can't even begin to imagine what their feelings were. And I'm not even going to try to describe it because I know I just cannot get at the core of how they must have felt when they saw that. And that they would have to go into this metal box with an owl on it and ride up the elevator to go see their child. The Indigenous Peoples Inclusion Network at Seattle Children's worked really hard to talk with hospital leaders and propose changes to this elevator and suggest other ideas. And so this all happened when I first came in, and so I was a part of that process of generating a list of hundreds of candidates. We narrowed it down, and I learned so much about different cultural perspectives about other animals that were living in the forest, because they wanted, Children's wanted this to be an animal that lived in the forest since it was in the forest part of the building. And so I learned a lot about cultural views from different cultures, about chipmunks, porcupines, deer, elk, other animals. I learned about how other cultures in Asia felt about some of these animals, how people in South America felt about some of these animals. I mean, it was a really eye-opening experience. And in the end, we settled on rabbit. And it seemed to be the safest of all the major contenders. I hope it still is. I know that some cultures associate rabbits with other activities, so I don't know, but people seem to be okay with this. But I think what I want to say is that it takes a lot of change and a lot of thought and a lot of effort, and no matter how, and I don't know, maybe rabbit is the safest. I don't know. I'm not the one to say, but for a lot of people, I heard in hallways that people were upset about having to change, and like, why are we always changing things around here, and what's the big deal with the owl anyway? But I think it was such an eye-opening experience for so many people to just learn that there's such a rich history from different cultures and different people. There's so many different perspectives. No matter how hard you try, you're never going to get it all right, but the best you can do is open up the conversation and learn. And I just want to say that I'm proud to be a part of an institution where they listen to concerns like this and take action to make positive change for people, for the betterment of patients, families, participants in research, regardless of cultural beliefs. And so although nobody is perfect and no institution is perfect, I think we really need to keep these conversations alive. So I want to close by reflecting on these different stories, and sharing them with you was not easy. So when I was asked to come up here and talk, I was really nervous. I didn't know what to talk about, and I thought, these stories are not easy. The path that I described was not a straightforward path. Sometimes doors opened up, and sometimes they closed on me, and I had to just wait until they opened again. There's no one way to do this work, and if you're in this area of trying to work with different diverse communities or to work with diverse patients, sometimes you will screw things up. But that's okay as long as you sit down and reflect and really think back on what you could have done differently, and look forward and look to the future. But I believe that we can all learn from each other, and I just want to thank all of you for letting me share my stories with you, and I hope that this will also inspire you to share your stories. Thank you.